He was there before she was taken. The video proves it, and the question investigators are now asking is not just who he is, but how many times he came back before he was ready. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old and in fragile health, has been missing from the Tucson, Arizona area for nearly 3 months. What began as a desperate search for a vulnerable elderly woman has transformed piece by piece into something investigators are now describing with a word that changes everything: planning. This was not spontaneous. This was not random. The person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was watching her home weeks before he took her. He knew when she came home. He knew when she went to sleep. He was there on January 11th, caught on video. Investigators believe he was there before that. And on the night of January 30th, he arrived wearing a mask and carrying a weapon and a backpack. He came, as those who have studied the footage have described it, mission ready. Tonight, a route has emerged. A route that her own daughter, Annie Guthrie, identified and shared with neighbors in the earliest days of the investigation. A map she put into a neighborhood group chat in the hope that anyone along that path might have footage that could help. A route that, when overlaid with other evidence, including a vehicle caught on a Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from the home, aligns in a way that investigators cannot and should not dismiss. A route that passes nail salons, elementary schools, a recently renovated commercial property, and intersections where any vehicle would have had to slow down just long enough for surveillance cameras that were present and recording to capture something useful. The question this investigation has been building toward for 3 months is not simply who took Nancy Guthrie. It is where did he go after? And tonight, the answer to that question may be getting closer because the route is mapped. The cameras along it are identified, and fresh federal investigators are now reviewing the accumulated evidence from the beginning. There are also new and urgent questions about the Uber driver who transported Nancy Guthrie on the night of her disappearance. The vehicle he drove, the cameras it may have contained, facing both inward and outward, the navigational data it generated about direction and timing. All of it is now being re-examined with a fresh perspective that the original investigation may not have applied with sufficient depth. This report covers the full scope of where this investigation stands: the route, the video, the vehicle data, the surveillance pattern that placed the suspect at the home before January 30th, the competing expert theories about what happened at the scene, and the serious questions now surrounding the law enforcement leadership of this case. Nancy Guthrie needs medicine she is not receiving. Every hour she remains missing is described by her family as agony. She deserves every investigative tool being applied to finding her. This report is the full accounting of what those tools are revealing. The footage from January 11th is the anchor point for understanding everything that followed on January 30th. Video surveillance captured an individual at Nancy Guthrie's home weeks before the night she disappeared. That individual was masked. He appeared on footage across multiple dates before the night he acted. Investigators and outside analysts who have reviewed the available footage have reached a consistent conclusion. This person was conducting reconnaissance. He was not there accidentally. He was not a neighbor or a delivery worker on a routine route. He was there to observe, to memorize patterns, to build a picture of when this home was occupied, when it was quiet, when its elderly resident was most vulnerable and least protected. The methodology displayed in that footage is consistent with what law enforcement professionals describe as pre-crime surveillance. It involves multiple visits to a target location over an extended period. It involves observing when lights come on and when they go off, when a vehicle arrives in the driveway, when movement can be seen through a window, when the occupant appears at the door or steps outside. It involves patience, calculation, and a willingness to return over and over without acting until the conditions are exactly right. What changed on January 30th was not the suspect's presence in the neighborhood. He had been there before. What changed was his equipment. On earlier visits he was observing, on January 30th, he brought a weapon and a backpack. The shift from empty hands to a loaded backpack and a weapon is the transition from reconnaissance to execution. He had completed his preparation. He knew everything he needed to know about the target. The only thing left to do was act. Nancy Guthrie had been picked up by an Uber driver that night and transported to her daughter Annie Guthrie's home, where the family had spent time together. When she returned home later that evening, the suspect was already in the area. He was positioned and waiting because he had watched long enough to understand the household's patterns and to anticipate roughly when she would come back and when the lights would go off. The Uber driver who transported her that evening now represents a critical evidentiary thread that investigators are taking very seriously. Modern rideshare vehicles frequently carry camera systems. Some face inward toward the passenger area. Some face outward through the windshield, recording what is ahead. Some have side cameras. The data from those cameras, combined with the vehicle's GPS and movement records, could reveal whether any vehicle in the neighborhood that night was behaving unusually. A vehicle parked where vehicles are not typically parked on a residential street. A vehicle that was present when Nancy Guthrie's Uber arrived, and that moved after she entered her home. A vehicle whose presence, in retrospect, makes sense only if its driver was waiting for a specific person at a specific time. Investigators and analysts examining this case have emphasized that even if no camera on the Uber itself captured the suspect's vehicle directly, the navigational and timestamp data from the vehicle establishes the precise moment Mrs. Guthrie was delivered home. That timestamp is the anchor for everything that happened in the hours that followed. Any footage from any camera in the corridor around her home from that timestamp forward is relevant. The vehicle driven by Annie Guthrie's husband that evening, which brought Nancy Guthrie back to her residence, similarly generates data. Modern vehicles, regardless of whether they carry visible camera systems, contain internal data recording systems, sometimes compared to the black boxes in aircraft. These systems track engine activity, door events, movement, speed, and direction. They create a record that exists independently of human testimony and that cannot be altered by someone who wants to adjust their account of where they were and what they did. That record, if it has been properly subpoenaed and analyzed, tells a story about the movements of the vehicle on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared that cannot be manipulated after the fact. Whether that analysis has been fully completed and what it revealed is not publicly confirmed. But its investigative importance is substantial, and fresh federal review of the accumulated evidence suggests it is being looked at with renewed attention. The route that Annie Guthrie mapped and shared with her neighbors deserves more than the treatment it has received. It deserves serious, systematic, camera-by-camera investigation. Annie Guthrie lives in the same community as her mother. She knows the roads. She knows which intersections are well lit, which stretches of road pass in front of commercial properties with exterior cameras, and which routes a person trying to leave the area without being noticed might choose. In the earliest days after her mother disappeared, she took that knowledge and turned it into something actionable. She drew a route, she shared it, she asked anyone along that path to look at their footage. That is not the behavior of someone impeding an investigation. That is the behavior of a daughter trying to find her mother by using every resource available to her, including her own knowledge of the community she lives in. The investigative community, looking back at dozens of cases where civilian input proved decisive, recognizes this kind of initiative as potentially valuable. The institutional tendency to discount it because it comes from a family member rather than a trained investigator is a documented flaw in how some investigations have been conducted, and it has cost investigations time they did not have. The route Annie Guthrie identified passes through a corridor that has specific characteristics worth examining in detail. At one location, an elementary school, the building is positioned such that cameras mounted at multiple corners of the structure have overlapping fields of view. Any vehicle traveling along the adjacent road at any hour would pass through the intersection of those fields. Camera systems at public schools in the current era are not afterthoughts. They are comprehensive security infrastructure installed to protect children. They are maintained, they record, and they capture the road in front of the building with consistency. At another location along the identified route, a nail salon has an exterior surveillance camera positioned to capture the parking lot and the adjacent roadway. That camera would have been recording in the early morning hours of January 30th into January 31st. If a vehicle traveling along Annie Guthrie's identified route passed that camera in the window of time consistent with when the abduction occurred, there is footage. A recently renovated commercial property along the same route presents an interesting set of considerations. Renovation of a retail space typically involves updated security infrastructure. New camera systems, newly wired and installed, are part of what a renovated commercial property puts in place before it reopens. Whether those systems were operational during the specific period in question, and what they captured if so, is a detail worth pursuing. The intersections along the mapped route are perhaps the most analytically significant camera locations. At any intersection with a stop sign or traffic signal, a vehicle cannot pass through at highway speed. It must slow. In some cases, it must stop. That mandatory deceleration gives any camera positioned at or near that intersection the time it needs to capture a useful image. A license plate, a vehicle type and color, a partial view of the driver, Any one of those elements, matched against other evidence, can move an investigation from uncertain to actionable. The additional finding that a vehicle spotted on a Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, a vehicle that was dismissed by local law enforcement in the early days of the investigation, falls within the corridor of Annie Guthrie's route map is not a coincidence to be set aside. Two independent pieces of information, a family member's route theory and a civilian's captured footage of an unfamiliar vehicle, aligning geographically in the same corridor at approximately the right time, is the kind of convergence that experienced investigators treat as worth pursuing. Even if that vehicle ultimately turns out to be unrelated, the investigative principle of following the convergence first is sound. A reason no footage from the more prominent camera locations along the route has surfaced publicly may lie in terrain. The Tucson area includes stretches of open desert that can be navigated outside of major road corridors, avoiding intersections and surveillance entirely. A suspect who had surveilled the area over multiple prior visits would know which intersections to avoid and which alternative paths existed. That knowledge would shape his choice of route. But knowledge of available alternatives does not mean perfect avoidance. At some point, any vehicle leaving the scene had to access a road, had to reach a gas station or a highway or a border-adjacent zone, and at that point, a camera somewhere was recording. Right now, subscribe so you are present when the footage that cracks this case is finally reported. Because based on everything developing in this investigation, that moment is coming. The competing theories about what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home that night require direct evaluation because not every theory that has entered the public record is equally supported by the physical evidence. A forensic psychologist advanced the argument that the crime scene was staged, that Nancy Guthrie may have been harmed or killed somewhere other than her home, and that the person responsible came back to the scene to create a false impression of where the crime occurred. This theory has been publicly circulated, and it deserves a serious response. The physical evidence at the scene does not support it. The biological material found at Nancy Guthrie's home, specifically the pattern of blood on the front porch surface, carries forensic characteristics that are inconsistent with blood that was transported from another location and deposited artificially. Blood deposited naturally, expelled under force from the nose or mouth at the scene, produces a specific distribution pattern. Larger drops create marks of a specific diameter. The satellite droplets surrounding those larger marks, the smaller particles that result from the energy of the impact, are distributed in a pattern that reflects the height, angle, and force of the original deposition. Recreating that pattern artificially would require knowledge and precision that is fundamentally inconsistent with the circumstances of this crime and the behavior visible in the suspect footage. Additionally, and perhaps more fundamentally, her pacemaker placed her at the scene that night. A pacemaker is a passive device. It does not lie. It records cardiac events at a specific location within a specific time window. It cannot be moved retroactively to place someone somewhere they were not. Her glasses were at the scene. Her walker was there. Her phone was there. Her shoes were there. A person who was taken from a different location and whose presence at this home was artificially staged would not leave behind a collection of personal objects whose arrangement is consistent with someone who was preparing for sleep and was interrupted before they could complete that preparation. What the physical evidence describes is an individual who was at that home that night, who was confronted by her abductor in a specific location on or near the front porch, who resisted, and whose resistance produced biological material at the scene. The forensic analysts who have reviewed the available images and descriptions of the scene have reached this conclusion consistently. The alternative theory requires a level of forensic knowledge, logistical access, and careful staging that is simply not consistent with the profile of this crime. That said, the value of having alternative theories examined is genuine. An investigation that has been immersed in its own assumptions for 3 months benefits from perspectives that challenge those assumptions. If a challenge can be measured against the physical evidence and found wanting, the investigation emerges with greater confidence in its foundational facts. That is what the stage scene theory has produced here. Not a new direction, but a reaffirmation of the physical evidence's reliability. The theory that this abduction was motivated by a connection to Savannah Guthrie's public profile, by contrast, is not contradicted by the physical evidence. It is consistent with it. A suspect who planned carefully, who surveilled over multiple visits, who knew when Nancy Guthrie was home and when she was most vulnerable, is a suspect who had access to information about this family's structure and this specific woman's connection to a nationally visible figure. That access could have come from public sources. It could have come from research, or it could reflect a specific existing grievance against the family that investigators are working to trace. The situation surrounding the sheriff leading the local investigation adds a dimension that is directly relevant to the case's future. A formal deadline was given for the sheriff to respond to questions about his conduct under oath. The deadline passed. What was submitted was unverified, unsworn material that did not meet the requirements of the formal process. The oversight body is now considering whether to proceed with formal accountability proceedings. Legal analysts and former investigators discussing this scenario have consistently raised the same concern. Any future prosecution in this case could be challenged at the stage of foundational integrity. An investigation conducted under leadership that was in formal institutional crisis, that had been found to make public statements that contradicted the evidence and that contradicted each other, creates a record that defense attorneys know how to use. The importance of the FBI's sustained involvement cannot be overstated in this context. Federal investigators operate under a chain of institutional accountability that is insulated from local political pressures. Whatever happens with the sheriff's standing, the federal investigation continues. The fresh eyes now reviewing the accumulated evidence bring federal resources, federal databases, and a perspective unclouded by the assumptions and pressures that have shaped the local investigation for 3 months. 3 months ago, Nancy Guthrie went to her daughter's house for the evening. She came home, and sometime after she came home, someone who had been waiting for that moment took her out. What the investigation has built since that night is a structure of evidence. Some of that structure is physical: the blood at the scene, the hair recovered from inside the home, the pacemaker data, the forensic material being processed in a federal laboratory. Some of it is behavioral: the footage of the suspect across multiple visits, the timeline he established through repeated reconnaissance, the specific changes in what he carried on the night he acted. Some of it is digital: the navigational records of the vehicles present that night, the cellular activity records that place people in specific locations, the surveillance cameras along the route Annie Guthrie identified, whose footage, some of it, must still exist somewhere. The fresh federal review of all accumulated evidence is the development that carries the most investigative weight right now. When experienced investigators approach a case fresh, they do not see the same case that the people who built it do. They see it from outside the assumptions that formed in the first days, the first weeks, the first months. They ask questions that the original investigators stopped asking because the answers seemed obvious. And sometimes the answer to a question that stopped being asked is the one that changes everything. The route Annie Guthrie mapped deserves to be that question. It deserves systematic, camera-by-camera investigation. It deserves the application of federal enhancement technology to footage from every commercial and residential security camera along that corridor. It deserves to be treated as the serious investigative lead it is, originating from a daughter who knows her community and who produced something specific and detailed when she was trying to find her mother. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She takes medication for her heart. She does not have it. Every day that passes is a day her family lives in agony and her community lives in fear. The person who took her has not been identified publicly. He has not been charged. He is somewhere, and so is she, and the investigation that has been working to connect those two facts has accumulated evidence that, when properly assembled, should point to the truth. The cameras are identified, the route is mapped, the vehicle data exists, the hair evidence is being processed. The federal investigators have fresh eyes on the full case record. The reward available to anyone who can provide actionable information is more than $1 million, and it does not require conviction or even an arrest to be claimed. If you have seen something, heard something, noticed something that connects to this case, that connection is worth a call. The investigators will determine its significance. You only need to provide what you know. The investigation is not finished. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. The person responsible has not faced accountability. Those are the facts as of today, and they are the facts that make every development in this case matter and every piece of evidence worth pursuing to its conclusion. The behavioral record visible in the surveillance footage across multiple visits before January 30th produces a specific psychological profile when read through the lens of what experienced investigators and forensic analysts know about how serious offenders operate. He is patient. The decision to return multiple times without acting, when each return represented an additional risk of being observed or remembered, is the decision of someone whose risk tolerance is calibrated by planning rather than by impulse. He weighed the benefit of additional reconnaissance against the risk of additional exposure and concluded repeatedly that more information was worth more risk. That calculus reflects a mind that is comfortable with deferred action in service of better preparation. He is operationally focused. His visits to the neighborhood were not random exploration. They had specific objectives. Each visit addressed a specific set of operational questions. When does the target return home? When do the lights go out? Is there a pattern to the timing? Are there neighbors who might observe an approach at night? Where does a vehicle park without attracting attention? The focused nature of his surveillance is reflected in what the footage shows: a person oriented towards specific points of the property rather than general exploration. He anticipated his own footage. He wore a mask, not just on the night of the abduction, but on the prior visits as well. The decision to wear a mask during surveillance visits, when no crime was yet being committed, reflects a recognition that he was creating a record that might later be examined and that could be used to identify him. He accepted being on camera, but ensured the camera could not capture his identity. That specific anticipation of investigative use of footage is a sophisticated operational consideration. He had a specific objective from the beginning. The choice of Nancy Guthrie as a target, an 84-year-old woman with a fragile heart who walked with a walker and who depended on others for transportation, is a specific choice. He did not choose a physically capable person. He chose someone whose vulnerability to being taken and controlled was inherent in her physical condition. That specificity suggests the target was chosen rather than encountered. He was not walking through a neighborhood and selecting her by chance. He was looking for someone with specific characteristics, and she fit them, or she was already known to him as a target for reasons connected to who she is and whose mother she is. The profile that emerges from this behavioral analysis is the profile of someone who planned this crime in advance, who researched the target, who invested significant time in preparation, and who executed when he was confident in his preparation. That profile is not the profile of a person who acts without thinking through consequences. It is the profile of a person who believes he has thought through every consequence and accounted for every risk, but he missed something. Every careful person misses something. The investigation is working to find what he missed. The decision to bring fresh investigators to review accumulated evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case is a standard investigative practice that is more significant than it might appear to casual observers. When investigators have been living inside a case for months, they develop what experienced analysts sometimes call assumption density. The assumptions that formed in the first days of the investigation about who the key actors are, about which pieces of evidence are most significant, about what the timeline of events looks like, become so embedded in how the investigation is conducted that evidence that contradicts those assumptions can be unconsciously minimized, not through dishonesty or incompetence, but through the natural cognitive tendency to organize new information within existing frameworks, rather than allowing new information to rebuild the framework from scratch. Fresh investigators do not have those assumptions. They approach the accumulated evidence without the cognitive weight of 3 months of immersion in a specific interpretive framework. When they look at a piece of footage that was reviewed early in the investigation and set aside as unimportant, they see it without the context that made it seem unimportant. When they examine a vehicle data record that was extracted but not fully analyzed, they approach it without the assumption that it was unlikely to produce useful information. When they review a civilian tip that was received and filed without follow-up, they evaluate it without the accumulated judgment that had made it seem less credible than the investigative leads being actively pursued at the time. What fresh eyes deliver, in practical terms, is the possibility of seeing what was always there but was not being looked at correctly. The history of major criminal investigations is full of cases where a fresh review of existing evidence by investigators who came to it without the assumptions of the original team produced the break that the original investigation had been missing. A piece of footage with a vehicle in the background that no one had focused on. A data record that contained a location that did not match the account given by a key person in the investigation. A witness statement that took on a different significance once a new piece of evidence provided the context that made it meaningful. The Nancy Guthrie case has 3 months of accumulated evidence. It has the route map Annie Guthrie identified. It has the camera network along that route. It has the vehicle data from multiple cars. It has the hair evidence from the home. It has the footage from January 11th and from January 30th. A fresh federal team reviewing all of that material, approaching it without the assumptions that have shaped the local investigation. It's the most significant investigative development that has occurred in this case in some time. And it may be the one that finally produces the confirmation the investigation needs. The route exists. The answer at the end of it is waiting to be found.